Johann Sebastian Bach is the ultimate composer's composer, influencing countless others who followed him, from Mozart to Mendelssohn, Beethoven to Brahms. And not just in classical music. From Duke Ellington to the Beatles, musicians in jazz and pop have also fallen under his spell and learnt from his techniques. Bach is still the benchmark, a musical gold standard. We know very little about Bach's life. There are only a few facts to go on, and our image of him is skewed by statues and paintings of a stern, forbidding figure in a frock coat and a powdered wig. But then there's the music. And the music tells us something completely different about him. It's full of energy, full of dance, full of life. Over a lifetime of getting to know, singing and conducting Bach's music, I formed a series of hunches about his personality and character. And in this film, I want to test them out with fellow Bach enthusiasts and scholars and perform some of his most important works to see what they can tell us about the extraordinary man who composed them.
He really throws everything at it. You know, it's just such an overwhelming exploration of what it is to be a human being.
I think he's a scientist at work, and instead of using the language of mathematics, he's a scientist using music.
The level of inspiration on which he works is, I think, unparalleled in the rest of music.
Such splendour and wonderfulness that on its own would convince me that there was a God if I felt inclined to take that conclusion from it.
In this film, I want to build a new statue of Bach, to see if we can detect a beating heart and a more approachable personality underneath the wig. My own engagement with Bach began as a small child growing up on a farm in Dorset. Just before the war, a refugee from Nazi Germany arrived with a painting in his rucksack, one that his great-grandfather had bought in a junk shop, and he asked my father to look after it for him. It was one of only 2 portraits painted of J.S. Bach in his lifetime. So I passed it every day of my life until I was 10, when the painting was sold and moved to Princeton, New Jersey. This is the first time I've seen it since 1953. What's so striking to me, seeing it again, is the intensity of his gaze. I mean, those eyes. It's just extraordinary. They're so penetrative. I still feel there's a division between the upper half of his face and the bottom half. The upper half is so intense. It's got that beetle-browed, slightly myopic look. Below that, you see somebody quite different. Somebody much more approachable, somebody who enjoyed the good things of life, a bon viveur who enjoyed his tobacco and his wine and his beer, and there's plenty of records of what he drank, and the father of 20 children and 2 wives. We know pitifully few hard facts about Bach. There's very little to go on, and only a handful of personal letters. But as in any good detective story, it's often the gaps, the seeming contradictions in the tale, that are as suggestive and intriguing as the hard evidence available. We do know that Johann Sebastian was born on the 21st of March, 1685, in Eisenach, in the middle of modern-day Germany. This is the so-called Bach House, now a museum devoted to him. Until recently, it billed itself as the house where Bach was born and where he grew up. We now know that's definitely not the case. As with so much of his life, exactly where Bach was born remains a mystery. Johann Sebastian was baptized here at 2 days old in St. George's Church in Eisenach. Later, he sang here in the choir. As a child, he's said to have had an unusually fine treble voice. 200 years before him, there was another chorister who stood in exactly the same place. Now, that was Martin Luther. And Luther created a revolution here in this part of Germany. Bach's whole life was to be profoundly influenced by Luther's Reformation. Luther set in train a new way of worship. It totally transformed the role of language and music in church. Bach's own music was filtered through his strongly held Lutheran beliefs and upbringing. Luther preached his Reformation here in the Georgenkirche in 1521, and then he disappeared. Actually, he hadn't gone far. In fact, in the greatest of secrecy, Luther was in hiding up here in the Wartburg, the imposing castle that looms above the town of Eisenach. His Reformation had made Luther the most wanted man in Europe. So this is a little room where Luther lived. For 10 months here, he was holed up, imprisoned really for his own good, because he was on the run from the Pope, from the Emperor. He was desperately constipated. The Lord has struck me in the rear, he said. And he thought that the devil was pelting him with walnuts from the ceiling. Luther decided that his best weapon to use against the devil was black ink. And in a matter of weeks, he sat down at this desk and he wrote a translation from the Greek of the New Testament. And it wasn't just in any old German. He decided that he needed to amalgamate 18 different dialects. And in effect, he established the roots of the German language as we know it. Not only did Luther want the Bible to be in the language of the people, he also wanted them to be able to join in the music, something that in the Catholic Church was much more the province of trained choirs. Luther was convinced that music added extra expression and eloquence to the biblical texts. The notes make the words come alive, he wrote. In fact, without music, man is little more than a stone. So the words appealed to the intellect and music appealed to the passions. And besides, why should the devil have all the good tunes? Luther and his followers made sure he didn't. They choraled secular tunes that everybody knew, including quite earthly love songs, and then set them to new words so that the congregation could belt them out in church. Hymns or chorales written by Luther and his followers became absolutely central to Protestant worship, and, of course, to the music of Bach. The impact of the reformer Luther on the impressionable young Bach was immeasurable. It shaped his whole view of the world, it bolstered his sense of worth as a craftsman musician, and it reinforced his service to the church. It's such an announcement, a proclamation of the arrival on earth of the Christ child. Relish the words, relish them. So, brich an. Bach's destiny was to become a musician. Music was the family business. In this part of Germany, in the heart of the Thuringian forest, the Bach family were thick on the ground, and they provided a support system to each other, and they carved up the different roles of
organist and cantor and Hausmann, which is the head of the local wind band, between them. And in fact, they became almost so important here that the word Bach and musician became synonymous.
The Bach clan knew how to let their hair down and often got together for raucous family celebrations. Sebastian, the youngest of 8 brothers and sisters, was thus surrounded by music at home, in church and in school.
I have in my hand what was probably the most precious book of Bach's childhood, certainly the one that he used every single day of his life until he left Eisenach. It's the Eisenachisches Gesangbuch, the song book, used in church and used in school. And it has wonderful copper engravings which show David and Solomon in the temple, surrounded by their temple musicians, and the connections that Bach must have made in his mind between his family of the most famous musicians in the area, with a long dynastic lineage going all the way back to Solomon.
Because he wrote so many masterpieces of sacred music, in the 19th century, religiously inclined writers liked to picture Bach as a saintly figure, a kind of fifth evangelist, to match the goody two-shoes image of his childhood. But in recent years, this picture started to change.
This is a book containing the records of Bach's school performance, and it gives us his syllabus of classes that he attended. And it also shows that, for example, in the 3rd year, he came 46th out of 89 pupils. And what's more, it tells us that he missed 96 separate classes. This is a fascinating document because it's somehow slipped under the radar. It's a report on school conditions in the Latin school where Bach was a pupil. And it shows the lack of textbooks, the overcrowding, the cheeking of the masters, the throwing of bricks through the windows, all sorts of proto-hooliganism. And it's been kind of neatly ironed out of all the biographies. And so it's really interesting to come to light now.
Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, more documents have come to light that greatly enhance our knowledge of Bach. In particular, the Bach archives in Leipzig have made huge strides in discovering more about the composer's working methods, and for the first time opened their doors to researchers. All the significant documents about Bach, many originals, some copies, are here.
When Bach was 50, he suddenly got a fascination for family roots and family trees, genealogy. So he wanted to give himself legitimacy in some way. And here's an example, and it shows the whole Bach family, starting with the legendary figure of Veit Bach, who arrived from Hungary in the middle of the 16th century. And it goes all the way through to Bach himself, who's over here, and then his children and his grandchildren. You'll notice every single member of the Bach family is a man. All blokes, not a single woman.
But mothers, sisters and aunts must have participated in their family music making. So, was it nature or nurture that we have to thank for the genius of Bach?
When he was 50, he did a family tree, and he also assembled pieces of his ancestors' music. And there was one person that he singled out as being a profound composer, another one who he singled out as being an able composer. But there obviously wasn't anybody of enormous quality until he came along. And yet he was one of 4 brothers. How come he and not the others popped up above the parapet?
He's such a good example because he really undermines any simplistic explanation of his genius. I mean, if you had a genetic explanation, then the genes would have gone throughout the Bach family. In fact, why did they take so long to generate Bach? So many generations. And I think all these more general explanations on the basis of genes, even on the basis of the musical culture that surrounded him, do not deliver the singular genius that he was. And it's a pity, in a way, we can't accept the singularity of people who are manifestly unique. We just can't bear the idea that genius is unexplained.
But that's not to say Bach was self-taught. His father's cousin, Johann Christoph, was the profound composer he referred to. His music, only recently rediscovered, is the link between Bach and the earlier German tradition. Johann Christoph may also have been Sebastian's first teacher at the organ, an instrument he was to make his own. But Johann Christoph's life was a cautionary tale. In a sense, the life of Johann Christoph Bach exemplifies the problems that musicians had at the time. They shuttled between the service of the church or of the court or occasionally of the municipality. And in Christoph's case, he had all manner of domestic problems. He was shunted also from pillar to post here in the town. The town wouldn't give him a proper dwelling. He had illness in his family. He was underpaid, and he was thoroughly querulous and miserable about it, and died in penury. But there's another side to it, and this is one that Sebastian may well have picked up from his elder cousin, which is that as a composer, you can channel all that frustration and disappointment into music. And the marvelous thing is about Johann Christoph's music and Sebastian's music is that it has this wonderfully consoling and uplifting quality to it.
Most of all, Bach's music offers us balm and comfort in bereavement. The subject of death appears again and again throughout his music, as it did in his own life.
This is the town cemetery, and Eisenach's old city walls are here on the right, and just beyond it is the school where Bach went, the old Dominican cloister. And somewhere here, in unmarked graves, are those of his parents, Elizabeth and Ambrosius. Elizabeth died when Bach was scarcely 9 years old, and then 9 months later, his father Ambrosius died as well. And Bach, as the youngest son and member of the local parish choir, had to witness the whole event and sing while the ceremony was going on and the slow tolling of the bell. And as the coffin was lowered into the grave, he and his fellow choristers sang Luther's words, "Mitten wir im Leben sind," in the midst of life, we're in death. His whole world must have collapsed.
His first wife was to die at the age of just 35. Even in an age of high infant mortality, of his 20 children, only 10 were to reach adulthood. After his parents died, Sebastian and his elder brother Jakob went to live with a sibling they hardly knew, Johann Christoph, 14 years older than Sebastian. He was the church organist at Ohrdruf, only 30 miles up the road, but it could have been a world away. I've come across documents in the local archives that show that conditions in Sebastian's school in Ohrdruf were every bit as deplorable as in the one he'd left behind in Eisenach. Ruffianism and loutish behaviour were rife here too, and there was a sadistic teacher. But curiously, Bach's grades improved.
Bach was the youngest son of quite a big family, and then suddenly he lost both parents before his 10th birthday, and he then went to live with his elder brother. How much of a trauma can that have been for him?
What you're describing is a triple bereavement. There's losing the parents, there's losing the home, new town, new place. I'd say that is pretty difficult for any child. We do have a lot of research showing that this kind of early bereavement and uprooting can scar people for life.
Do you think his school grades are relevant and interesting here? Because when he was in Eisenach, when he was still with his parents, he played truant an awful lot. After he moves into his elder brother's house, his school grades rocket. They go way up. So there's a big change there. Do you think that's to do with the orphanhood?
Again, I'm speculating, but what I'm hearing here is that there was a horrible, horrible environment in the school, but maybe there was a little bit of protection from the home. Then he loses the home. So now the whole world is a dog-eat-dog situation. There's only one person he can rely on, and that's himself, which would explain why he has to be good at school now, doesn't he? He has to, because basically, if you show weakness, if you are weak, you suffer and you go under.
At the age of 15, Bach was awarded a singing scholarship at a school in Lüneburg, 230 miles to the north. He walked the whole way with a school friend, Georg Erdmann, who would re-enter the Bach story 30 years later. Bach spent 3 years in Lüneburg from the age of 15 to 18. His voice would have broken almost as soon as he got there. So what was he doing in the meantime? This is one of the great puzzles of Bach's life. One thing we do know is that while he was at Lüneburg, Bach was acquainted with one of Germany's leading musical figures, Georg Böhm, a composer and a renowned organist, also born in Thuringia, like Bach himself. This is a letter that Carl Philipp Emanuel wrote to Bach's first biographer, Johann Nicolas Forkel, telling him all the bits and pieces that he could remember about his father. And the particularly interesting thing here is when he refers to his former teacher, Georg Böhm, he crosses it out. Why, having written that Böhm was his father's teacher, did Emanuel think better of it and erase the reference? In 2005, a suggestive new clue came to light. Some leaves of organ tablature, for many years wrongly catalogued in a German library, were rediscovered by Leipzig Bach archivist Michael Maul.
When I read the Latin phrase at the end of the manuscript, copied after a manuscript of Georg Böhm in the year of 1700 in Lüneburg. And I know one person who was in 1700 in Lüneburg and was very interested in very good organ music, and that's the young J.S. Bach. After comparing the manuscript with the other examples, we can be absolutely sure that no one else than Bach is the writer of these manuscripts.
I mean, this is the missing piece in the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it says that he wrote this on paper belonging to Georg Böhm. So he went and maybe became a student or an apprentice to Georg Böhm.
Yes.
And under his supervision wrote out this very difficult piece, which proves that he played this music. So he was already a virtuoso. Did Emanuel suddenly remember that his father, for some reason, didn't wish his relationship with Georg Böhm to be known?
Did he acknowledge that he learned from other people? Did he acknowledge their greatness?
This is fascinating because when he made remarks about possible teachers, his son Emanuel just erased them. So Bach didn't want that to be known. He wanted everybody to know that he'd done it entirely on his own, off his own bat.
If he had this assumption that you have got to have power and you should never show weakness, he would be very poor in acknowledging those sources.
At the age of 18, Bach, as well as being a virtuoso organist, was a competent violinist. In 1703, he left Lüneburg to return to the family stamping ground. In Arnstadt, only 30 miles from where Sebastian was born, the city fathers had put a tax on beer in order to pay for a brand new organ for the Neue Kirche. Bach was hired to test the new organ and then to play it in audition in front of the thirsty citizens. He landed the job on more money than his father had ever earned. But there was a catch. The council insisted that he provide new music. All he had at his disposal was a ragtag and bobtail band made up of mature students. Thus Bach began his career as a composer, but not in exactly auspicious circumstances. He wrote a cantata, his first, in which there's a very important bassoon obbligato, a solo for the bassoon in 3 of the movements. It was a banana skin. The bassoon part starts innocuously enough, honking away at a steady old lick. But then comes a bassoonist's worst nightmare.
Within the space of about 2.5 bars, he sends the bassoon through a whole list of different keys involving very, very, very complicated fingerings.
Deliberately or not, Bach had set a trap for his resident bassoonist. He was writing for a fellow called Bach, who, in rehearsal, made a complete hash of it. And Bach was exasperated to the point when he called him a Zippelfagottist, which can be translated variously as a nanny goat bassoon or a greenhorn bassoon. But in reality, Bach was calling him a prick. Yet another translation is bassoonist breaking wind after eating a green onion. However Bach understood the term, he didn't like what he was hearing. The insult clearly rankled, and Bach plotted his revenge. And he and his cronies, well-oiled after a party christening, sat in wait for Bach, here in the town square. Bach was making his way back from playing music at the castle, Nideck Castle, and was taken completely by surprise. And Bach came up to him and demanded an apology, and then took his cudgel and hit Bach smack across the face. Bach, in self-defense, drew his rapier, and there was a scuffle, a major scuffle, and it was only the other students who eventually stopped the whole thing. No doubt to Bach's fury, the church council sided with Bach, according to the records. And that was far from the last of the problems. Bach was accused of introducing strange harmonies into his organ music, which upset the old dears of the parish. He played either far too long or not long enough, and he'd slipped off down to the pub. Once, he smuggled a strange girl into his organ loft to make music. The final straw came when he asked for 4 weeks' leave to visit the renowned organist Buxtehude, walking the whole 260 miles up to Lübeck. In fact, he was away 4 months, not 4 weeks, and was airily dismissive when he was asked to explain himself. What we now see is patterns of behavior that had their origins in the unhealthy environment of his early schooling, first in Eisenach and then in Ohrdruf. Patterns of anger, patterns of dealing with authority in a very surly and uncompromising way, impatience, and a kind of self-assuredness that was bound to rub people up the wrong way. Bach is commemorated in Arnstadt by this curious recent statue in Jack the Lad pose, perhaps in a nod to his feisty and fractious stay here. His time in Arnstadt came to an end when in 1707 he was offered a new post 50 miles up the road in Mühlhausen. The city had been thriving, but it was Bach's bad luck to arrive just after a disastrous fire had wreaked havoc in the city. Caught up in a local dispute between the clergy, Bach moved on in less than a year. But 2 significant things happened. First, aged 22, he married his cousin, Maria Barbara. And then he wrote one of the most important documents we have. Here's a letter that Bach wrote to the Mühlhausen town council explaining the reasons why he handed in his resignation. And the interesting thing from our point of view is that he defines his Endzweck, as he called it, his final ambition, his goal in life. The key phrase is, a well-regulated church music to the glory of God. Germany was on the brink of the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution had been in full swing for over a century, but superstition was still rife. Here, as late as the 1730s, witches were being burnt at the stake. The 30 Years' War had ended in 1648, and in its wake came a strong revival of Lutheranism. Bach took it upon himself to lay down the New and the Old Testament commandments with renewed force.
In 1708, Bach left Mühlhausen for the elegant court of Weimar. This was a real turning point. For the first time in his life, he was able to call on good quality musicians. But as so often in his career, there was a snag. In fact, there were two of them. Weimar was ruled by a pair of dukes, an uncle and nephew team. It was a recipe for disaster. The musicians were employed by both, but the uncle made it known to the musicians that if they played for his nephew, they would be liable to be flogged, dismissed out of hand. In fact, there was one poor horn player who was dismissed on the spot, flogged, and then eventually hung as an example, terrible example to all the other musicians what would happen if they stepped out of line. One might imagine that in such a fraught, tense situation, nothing creative could have come out of Bach's time in Weimar, but of course the opposite is true. It was a hugely stimulating time for him. His first encounter with the Italian music of Vivaldi and of Corelli and so on. And from Bach's own compositional activity, it was an enormously important time. We got the beginnings of his really, really important keyboard works, and not only that, his cantatas, amazing cantatas that he started to write for Weimar, for the Kapelle, and performed up in the Himmelsburg. Originally, a cantata was a small, intimate Italian piece for a solo voice and a couple of instruments. But soon it was taken over by German composers in the century before Bach and was associated with the Lutheran liturgy. But by the time Bach came along, it had grown into something almost gargantuan. His 200 pieces last anything from 25 to 30 minutes each, occupied a place somewhere between the reading of the lesson and the sermon, and they reflected the theme of the day, as it were. You pity the unfortunate preacher who had to follow music as eloquent as this.
Siehe, siehe, ich stehe vor der Tür und klopfe an, so jemand meine Stimme hören wird und die Tür auftun, zu dem werde ich eingehen und das Abendmahl mit ihm halten und er mit mir.
Bach demonstrates his fantastic ability to set a scene, in this case, Jesus knocking at the door of the human heart. Bach wrote more than 20 cantatas in Weimar, but having proved his early mastery of the form, he suddenly stopped. The court's musical director had died, and when the resulting vacancy was filled by his son, a musical nullity, and not by Bach, his reaction was to down tools. He simply stopped composing. It went from bad to worse. When Bach asked to leave his employ, the fiery Wilhelm Ernst had him thrown into jail. Bach thus became one of the few composers in history to do hard time.
Some of his music, technically the property of his employer, may have stayed on at Weimar. 70 years later, the Himmelsburg burnt to the ground, and Bach's music was lost forever. After a month in prison, Bach headed off to the job he'd been hankering after all along, that of Kapellmeister. He joined a music-loving Prince, Leopold, at the castle in Köthen, not far from Weimar, as his music director.
And it was the beginning of a wonderful new phase in his life. 5.5 years of relative trouble-free composition. The first time in his life where he's away from the church. He's in a secular environment because he doesn't have to write church music. Prince Leopold is a Calvinist. There's no requirements of Lutheran church music at his court. Bach is settled with his family, and he has a sympathetic and extremely music-conscious and music-enthusiastic boss. Bach completed the famous Brandenburg concertos at Köthen, as well as a set of solo cello suites, which are today amongst his most popular works. Just as Bach was, for once, happy and settled, tragedy struck. While he was on a trip to Bohemia with the prince, the only time Bach ever left Germany, his wife, Maria Barbara, died unexpectedly and was buried before he returned and could be told of her death. Their marriage seems to have been a happy one, and this sudden bereavement was another crushing blow for Bach. No one knew better than he how terrifyingly unpredictable an assignation with death could be.
Menschenkind. Oh Menschenkind, hör auf geschwind, hör auf geschwind, hör auf. Oh Menschenkind, geschwind, hör auf geschwind, geschwind. Die sind zu lieb. Oh Menschenkind, hör auf geschwind, die sind zu lieben.
A year and a half after his first wife died, Bach married Anna Magdalena, a professional singer at the Köthen court, 16 years his junior. She was to bear him another 13 children, 7 of whom died in infancy. For his new wife, and at her request, Bach gathered together the music of the Anna Magdalena notebooks. Also at Köthen, he began the 48 preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavier. It's typical of Bach that to test out a new tuning system, he wrote 2 pieces for each key, major and minor.
For me, the driving thing for Bach, I think, must have been this obsessive rigour. I mean, this is someone who, I think, you know, in writing a collection of keyboard works in every key, I think it's not just that that's available to him. I think he couldn't possibly have done it any other way. I think he would have had to have explored every single key and done it again twice.
Bach's inventiveness is proved by a puzzle contained in the music he's showing us in the famous portrait I passed every day as a child. On the face of it, the piece is straightforward enough.
It's incredibly simple. It sounds just almost like a nursery rhyme. But that's the version that we see as he shows it to us in the portrait.
But from his perspective, what do we see?
Well, if you turn the music up the other way around and read it backwards, what you get is this.
In other words, what's in my head and what you see and what you hear are two different things.
Yeah, I think he's got like a secret smile, and he's not quite looking at it, is he? It's like he knows something that we don't. And I love the fact that it took 100 years for people to start working it out.
The clue is in the title. It's a piece not for 3, but for 6 voices.
If you move the reverse version by a bar, you get this incredible 6-part bit of pop music, really. It's so simple, so complex.
Do you subscribe to the view that a lot of his music is numerological, that it is reflecting not simply just his own name, but actually that he, as a starting mechanism, would rule the paper and measure out the number of bars that he was actually going to use? Or is that just baloney?
I think it was a hugely creative structural mechanism for him, but that was an intuition that he had around numbers and the appeal of numbers for him. And I think he had an almost obsessive enjoyment of pattern, which for me is the mark of a scientist as well. Scientists look for and respond to pattern in nature, and when they find it, they try and categorise it and put rules around it, and then they try and break the rules, and that's the fun bit, is playing with the pattern that they find. And I think it's an intuition that he has, not as a mathematician as such, but more broadly as a scientist.
In his own lifetime, Bach was far more famous as a performer than as a composer. He wrote many pieces for the organ, an instrument on which he was renowned as an improviser of genius. He also stretched the boundaries of another instrument he himself performed on, writing a series of solo dance suites for the violin.
They are light years ahead of anything that was written for the solo violin ever before. He just takes the violin to into a different realm and asks from the violin to do very unviolinistic things, like triple stops, quadruple stops, polyphonic writing, fugues. You know, fugues were written for harpsichords and for organs and for orchestras, but not for one solo violin.
That is storytelling too. It's a story, if you like, about 4 notes, about D, C, B flat and A. But it's also a soliloquy. It's a very dramatic argument in a similar way to Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be, where you've got a voice arguing with itself and listening to the counter-arguments and arguing with the counter-arguments and speaking against the counter and so on. There's the continual wonder that he brings it about in the way that he does, which seems to me an absolute miracle, a piece of such splendour and wonderfulness that it on its own would convince me that there was a God if I felt inclined to take that conclusion from it.
Aged 38, Bach was now at the very peak of his powers. But his lifetime's goal, his Endzweck of writing a well-regulated church music to the glory of God, had been on hold for the past 6 years.
The opportunities for writing church music to a high standard only came to Bach very, very rarely in his life. It didn't come in Arnstadt, it didn't come in Mühlhausen, it came for a while in Weimar, not at all in Köthen, because in Köthen he was working in a Calvinistic court, and then he had this big break.
Suddenly he saw an opportunity to put his life's ambition into effect. In 1723, there was a vacancy in Leipzig, one of the most important cultural centres in Germany and a thriving cosmopolitan city. Cantor of the Thomasschule, one of the oldest and most prestigious choir schools in Europe, founded in 1212. This was a full-on boys' choir, the younger ones singing treble and alto, the older ones tenor and bass, and playing instruments. It was a great opportunity, but there were problems in plenty awaiting him.
Besides music, Bach's duties would also include teaching the boys other school subjects, but he drew the line at teaching them Latin. What's more, only a thin party wall would separate the boys' dormitories and classrooms from Bach's own private living quarters.
Bach's determination to see his church music project through eventually overcame his reservations. In April 1723, he showed up at the Leipzig City Hall to be interviewed and offered the job.
So despite all his misgivings, Bach decided to throw in his lot and to accept the title of Thomaskantor and director of the city music here in Leipzig. So he signed his contract and he swore fealty on the Holy Bible.
One of the councillors is on record as saying, since the best man couldn't be obtained, mediocre ones would have to be accepted. The truth is that neither party to this contract could have guessed what they were letting themselves in for. In Bach's own words, hindrance and vexation.
From the moment he set foot in Leipzig, Bach found himself caught in the political crossfire between different factions on the city council. Music, since it carried with it an element of cultural prestige, formed a part of those political tensions. On the one hand, on the city council were those loyal to the elector who wanted a modern Kapellmeister, one who could bring real international prestige to the city, and they were Bach's natural allies. But opposed to them were the Estates Party, who wanted a traditional cantor tied into the school system with all its regulations and with all its teaching duties, and that throttled Bach's room for maneuver.
Before these problems boiled to the surface, Bach set to work. It used to be thought that his cantatas, well over 200 of them, and the two great passions, were composed over the whole 27 years he spent in Leipzig. But in the 1950s, an astonishing discovery was made. By a careful examination of the watermarks on the original scores and parts, scholars discovered that the greater part of the cantatas and passions were actually produced in a white-hot frenzy of just 3 years.
Now, how he kept up that rhythm, how he managed to sustain that level of intensity and creativity is just beyond belief.
Particularly when you consider Bach's living conditions. This is a model of the Thomas School. The original building was torn down in 1902. Here, Bach and his family lived right next to the schoolboys.
There wasn't enough room for all the kids, and they slept two to a bed. And, I mean, there must have been a heck of a lot of background noise. And he had to concentrate to produce these phenomenal pieces and then to supervise their copying out in his own room?
I think so.
But you wonder how he could ever have had any sort of private life in this sort of outfit. I mean, the conditions being so cramped and the noise and the descriptions of mice and rats running up and down the staircases as well.
Yeah, they probably had a different concept of private life back then.
Must have done.
Bach didn't just have to write 25 minutes of new music each week. He also had to get it copied into individual parts for the musicians to sing and play from. His already cramped lodgings now had to accommodate not just his large family, but also cousins and live-in apprentices to help with the never-ending copying out.
In the pressure cooker atmosphere of the Thomasschule and this devastating pace that Bach had set himself, things started to go wrong. If you look at this, you'll see there's a frenzy in the writing. It's almost as though he hardly has time to actually put the beams of the semiquavers and demi-semiquavers into the page. They look like bamboos in a hurricane. And here's something interesting, because this is Kuhnau, one of his favorite copyists. And Bach, leaning over to see what Kuhnau's copied, notices that his name has been misspelt, B-A-C-C-H. He gives him a hell of a cuff across the ear-holes, and the ink flies across the page. And here's another example. A cousin, Johann Heinrich, came to Leipzig, and Bach put him to work immediately in the sweatshop of copying. He's made a complete hash of it. He's written out the chorale in the wrong clef and mistransposed it. So he has to cross it all out, and Bach himself has to leap in and write out the chorale neatly at the end. I mean, what a plonker. Here you can see Bach painstakingly trying to repair the damage against the clock to make sure that there weren't terrible errors on the music stands when it came to the one and only rehearsal before the cantata was performed.
Bach had constantly to adjust his music to the talents and skills of his available musicians. But also, he had to lure in university students in exchange for private music lessons.
There's something about Bach's orthography, his handwriting, which suggests already the gesture, the direction of a phrase.
In some cases, Bach was forced to pay for extra musicians from his supplementary earnings, made from playing at weddings and funerals. At the end of each frantic week, Bach unveiled his latest cantata. What the Leipzig congregation made of these towering works, frustratingly, we simply don't know. All we do know is that plenty of people would have heard them.
Leipzig was known as the city of churches. It's been estimated that on a normal Sunday, of a population of 30,000, 9,000 parishioners and members of society were crammed into these two churches, the Thomaskirche, the Nikolaikirche, and bulging from the seams of the other churches in the town.
Thus, every week, Bach had an audience 10 or a dozen times bigger than in any opera house. Unfortunately, people at the main churches tended to behave as if they were in an opera house, much to the fury of the clergy.
The preachers very often think they don't listen carefully to the sermons, that's for sure. You get all kinds of complaints about people flirting in church, people sleeping in church, people throwing paper airplanes in church, yes, and taking snuff in church.
And
all
dogs
kinds
coming
of
into the
dogs
church.
Coming into church, absolutely. And some churches employ special dog whippers to try to get the dogs out. But, and I mean, earlier on you've had complaints about people taking pigs through church because it's the quickest way from where the pig was to market and so on. So I think our sense of proper behaviour within a church is different.
So there must have been a huge amount of noise, and one of the problems, that's one of the few things we really do know, is that people drifted in and out before the sermon, after the sermon, during the music. It must have been chaos. Everything was very, very stratified here socially. So the ladies were seated down here below, and the men were in the two galleries, both sides, and the hoi polloi were at the back with the riffraff. And the music, of course, came from the back of the church, up in the organ gallery. And it was raining down on the congregation, but exactly at the moment when the ladies made their grand entrance. And given the fact this is Germany, there was a huge amount of social greetings, wie geht es Ihnen, gnädige Frau, that sort of thing, while the ladies took their seats and then gazed up adoringly at the preacher about to give his sermon. And the hubbub during Bach's music must have been excruciating. Poor man.
This, then, is the congregation who first heard the masterpiece Bach presented at the Nikolaikirche on Good Friday, 1724. It was his first Passion oratorio, the central jewel of his necklace of cantatas, a musical retelling of the story of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. There'd been passions before, but nothing so radical, so complex or as ambitious as Bach's John Passion. He ingeniously blends orchestral and choral writing into a thrilling amalgam of storytelling, meditation and drama.
Can I just have the cello and bass, please? Now, viola start. Bar 1. That's okay. Now, can we just add the violins, please? And good, that's it. Right, thank you. And just flutes and oboes, please. And 1.
It's like nails being driven into bare flesh.
That's it, that's it, that's it. In this opening chorus, he does something which none of the other people had done, which is to set up a huge dynamic tension between this turbulence in the orchestra going on and this tremendous acclamation of Christ in Majesty. Bach was not trying to write an opera. Bach's purpose was to draw the listener in, to recreate in front of their ears and eyes the drama of Christ's crucifixion. And his St. John Passion is an extraordinary amalgam of theology and music, religion and politics, drama and wonderful presentation of storytelling. So we sense the tension that's already in St. John's Gospel, that between light and darkness, between sin and good work, and faith and doubt.
John is particularly remarkable because you could say that in his account of the Passion, everybody else suffers and is perplexed and agonized, and Jesus is utterly stable. I mean, he's not suffering, he's not under things, he sort of stands there
Zen-like.
over and above them.
Zen-like.
He's extremely enigmatic.
Jesus antwortete, du sagst, ich bin ein Ich bin dazu geboren und in die Welt kommen, dass ich die Wahrheit zeugen soll. Wer aus der Wahrheit ist, der höret meine Stimme.
I mean, in the middle you have Christ's sacrifice. in which he takes upon himself human sin and gives people back grace. That's in the middle. And then on one side of that, there are the individuals in the text, particularly Pilate. Then on either side of that, there is community. There's the mad community.
The mob.
Of the chorus, the mob, hysterical, paranoid, and utterly deranged, really. On the other side is the present community, which is in order and sings these sculptural, monumental chorales. So there you have, as you say, ticks all the boxes. He includes the whole thing, the whole human thing, individual, social.
And it's a reflection of Lutheran ordered society.
It is.
Today, the St. John Passion is accepted as a masterpiece. But at its first performance, it didn't please the Leipzig clergy, ever suspicious and alert to the danger of music stealing their thunder. Bach was forced to revise it radically over the next year, and only towards the end of his life was it once again performed in a version close to its original. Without so much as a break, Bach began another round of cantatas. This time the cycle was based on iconic chorales, and Bach had to write a new work each week. The cycle is breathtaking in the variety of its moods, intensely serious at one moment, cheeky at the next.
Doch endsigen Schritten, o Jesu, Meister, zu helfen zu dir, zu dir, zu dir, zu dir. Wir eilen mit schwachen, doch emsigen Schritten, o Jesu, Meister, zu helfen zu dir, zu dir.
Measure him against any of his contemporaries, and there's one thing that makes Bach stick out from all the rest. He didn't write an opera, not a single opera. And yet, at the time, opera was really the gold currency. It was the thing that established careers. It brought with it fame, it brought with it success, it brought with it a lot of money. And Bach would have none of that. In fact, he talked rather disparagingly of those little ditties that you could hear at the Dresden Opera. And yet, his music is intrinsically as dramatic, if not more dramatic, than that of any of the opera composers of the day. Vivaldi, Scarlatti, Telemann, none could match Bach in this respect. Only Handel came close. Everything Bach had learnt up to now, dramatic scene setting to underpin the gospel narration, and subtle musical power to convey contrition and remorse, was poured into his St. Matthew Passion, first performed at the Thomaskirche, Leipzig, on Good Friday, 1727. The St. Matthew Passion is even more atmospheric than the St. John. Lasting around 2.5 hours, it's even more monumental in scale, with a double choir and a double orchestra.
He speaks with the voice of someone whose belief is absolutely rock solid, goes right to the roots of his being. He believes this, every word of this. It is true. It is completely true. And there's a solidity, a firmness to what comes through in the Passions that I've seen very rarely anywhere else.
Jesus sprach zu ihm, du sagst, doch sage ich euch, von nun an wird's geschehen, dass ihr sehen werdet des Menschen Sohn, sitzen zur Rechten der Kraft und kommen in den Wolken des Himmels.
You wonder, well, where is there room for Bach's own voice? It's difficult to answer, but I feel there are moments, there are chinks in the drama where you feel that Bach himself is very much present and very much making the decisions.
So you've got a crotchet to turn around completely 180 degrees from being an absolutely foul-mouthed mob into being contrite and responsible and tender. And bewildered. Who's hit you? We don't understand. Go.
The choir have to switch into being the community, the believers. And it's in that moment that I feel Bach is saying, this suffering is unbearable. We have to stop it. We have to show our sense of moral outrage.
The emotional centre of the Matthew Passion is Erbarme dich, Peter's plea for forgiveness, having denied his Christ.
In comes the violin announcing Erbarme dich, and the violin, with no words at all, can convey, in a way that the human voice could not convey, this concentration of lamentation, of grief, of contrition, of utter abject horror, in a way, and yet taking on to a spiritual level, because the voice line of the violin becomes an agency of compassion and of forgiveness. And that's before the singer's sung a note.
3 years after the St. Matthew Passion, Bach's relationship with his masters began to fall apart. In 1730, he wrote what he called an Entwurf, a memorandum to the Leipzig Council, complaining bitterly that he could no longer operate. He hadn't sufficient musicians and too few of quality to perform his work. Several months later, Bach took up his pen again.
And this is the most poignant document of all for me. It's the only truly personal letter we have of Bach's, in which he's writing to his old pal Georg Erdmann. He was the guy that Bach walked from Ohrdruf to Lüneburg with when they were both in their teens, early teens. And Bach is just pouring out all his frustration about why the council had not responded to this Entwurf, this statement of his intentions. And Bach tells Erdmann, "My life is full of hindrance and vexation, and I see no future for myself and my family here."
One of the features that you might expect to see in this inflexible persona, if you like, is that he would never be guilty. No matter what happened, it's always somebody else's fault. Does that ring?
Yes, it does. Because he's never to blame. He always has a reason. And his motto, I don't know whether it's his motto, but it's like a mantra that comes up and again, is that my life is lived always with vexation and hindrance.
I have brought you something here, which is a textbook definition. And this is paranoid personality disorder. And these are the characteristics: pervasive suspicion of others, distrusting their motives, others seen as deliberately demeaning or threatening, constantly expect to be harmed or exploited, very sensitive to perceived slights, fear and avoidance of anything that could make them feel or seem weak.
That's a perfect description.
The one thing that we do know is that there is an association with bullying and abuse in childhood.
Thanks to the boneheadedness of the City Fathers and the obvious flaws in Bach's own character, his output of religious music now began to dwindle away.
St. Thomas's Church didn't deserve those cantatas. Nobody deserved those cantatas, but least of all St. Thomas's Church. That's the striking thing about a great artist, is they deliver absurdly over contract, heartbreakingly over contract. And that is the thing that I think is most impressive, very deeply moving about him. There he is, worrying about his children, who are popping off one after the other, worrying about their education, trying to keep the town councillors less irritated, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, he just delivered this work that 250, 260 years later is supreme in the canon.
Bach now gravitated towards the other main centre of music making in Leipzig, the thriving coffeehouse scene. Here was a different audience, a more relaxed ambience in which to make music, with better musicians from the university, eager to learn from the master. But Bach didn't completely give up on sacred music. Indeed, his new secular style found its way into religious pieces of unbuttoned high spirits.
Mein gläubiges Herz frohlocke, sing Scherze. Mein gläubiges Herz frohlocke, sing Scherze. Frohlocke, sing Scherze, dein Jesus ist da. Mein gläubiges Herz frohlocke, sing Scherze. Frohlocke, sing Scherze, dein Jesus ist da.
Throughout his life, Bach had much more than his fair share of heartbreak. That direct experience of personal grief comes over in his music, but never in a saccharine or morbid way, but as consoling, soothing, uplifting.
In many ways, you can imagine he's creating a lullaby for himself, which again becomes a lullaby for all of us, a profound lullaby, which comforts him and through him comforts us.
Es ist vollbracht. Es ist vollbracht. Das
The thing that's, to me, is so touching and powerful in the expression of the music is the way that Bach seems to focus all that distress and private grief in his own life. The loss of parents, the loss of children, the loss of a wife, always the difficulties that he was experiencing. And yet the music that comes out of it is so ineffably consoling and
nowadays we look at the texts, and with this constant longing for death, this anticipation with joy of one's final demise, it seems bizarre to us, and yet it's with the as you say, Bach's private grief, it was commonplace. Everybody's private grief.
Absolutely.
Everybody was losing their families, their babies, their wives, and this is surely the prime purpose of religion at that time was to give a consolation in the face of this baffling reality.
With his disagreements with the council dragging on and on, Bach now had a new power struggle, this time with the headmaster of the Thomas School, who was bitterly opposed to all the emphasis on music in school. In Bach's desire to put an end to his woes in Leipzig, we find the origins of one late religious masterpiece, the B minor Mass.
Just try and think how different this is from Messiah. I mean, Messiah, you've got the angels wafting in on a cloud, and they come in and they sing and then they disappear all very gently. Here, it's a stomp. It's much more kind of Bruegel than Botticelli. It's not whiffy-waffy at all. Okay, off we go. Yep.
Bach was angling for a new job, or at the very least an honorary title, at the court in Dresden, which was Catholic. So despite his unwavering commitment to Lutheranism, Bach, ever practical, saw that there was an opportunity for composing a Latin Mass on a grand scale. Bach didn't get his hoped-for move to Dresden, although he did get the honorary title, and for the next 15 years we lose all trace of the B minor Mass.
And then suddenly we have a Missa Tota, a complete Catholic Mass, with the magnificent credo and the wonderful Agnus Dei and the touching way it ends with the Dona Nobis Pacem. This was Bach's compendium of all the styles since he was a young composer, up to the most recent music that he composed. It was his version of Ars Perfecta, of art perfected.
I mean, this is Bach at his most playful, most jazzy, and most exotic, and it's ebullient. And that's what we need to feel, because there's something really folky about this music. See if we can get that through. Come.
A question that can never be solved is what Bach himself thought of his work. But we do have one clue that suggests he saw himself and his music as inextricably linked.
He loves inscribing his own name, B-A-C-H, the family name, into his music in all sorts of contexts. And you can only do that in German because H doesn't exist in English. You know, it's not a note on the piano. But in German, B is B flat, isn't it? A, C, B natural, which is H. So that's the little kind of family motto that's in there.
One of Bach's most famous last works, the Art of Fugue, breaks off in mid-flow. The reasons why this happened have long been debated.
I thought what we'd do is actually go just from where he inscribes his own name, B-A-C-H, because that's what's so extraordinary about this piece, is that he finds a way halfway through this whole composition to put his name in and then to develop it. So we've got two fugues going on, and then suddenly it comes to an abrupt halt. And according to Carl Philipp Emanuel, he stopped then because he died. That was it. It's just chilling. Let's try it.
My fantasy is that it's completely
deliberate,
and that actually it's that unfinished business that I've written my music for the future, and someone else is going to carry on now.
Bach died aged 65 in Leipzig in the Thomasschule on the 28th of July 1750. 2 successive eye operations performed by an English quack doctor seem to have finished him off. After his death, his works fell out of favour, though not with everyone. His music was passed from hand to hand, and Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven all marvelled at it. Only in 1829, when Mendelssohn performed a devoted but stylistically mangled version of the Matthew Passion, did Bach begin to regain the public's affection. Bach's legacy is assured. If Monteverdi was the first composer to find musical expression for human passion, and Beethoven, what a terrible struggle it is to be human and to aspire to be godlike, Mozart, the kind of music we'd hope to hear in heaven, Bach is the one who bridges the gap. He helps us to hear the voice of God, but in human form, ironing out the imperfections of humanity in the perfection of his music.